Good evening, everyone. It's me, Dr. Plague. We talk a lot about horror on this channel, but the real horror out there is how easy it is for your data to fall in the hands of disreputable people. That's why today's video is sponsored by Aura. While you're enjoying today's spooky video, data brokers, those things that go bump on the web, could already be selling your information to scanners, spammers, and anyone else who may want to target you. Your full name, email, home address, your health records, your relatives, they could all be out there. That's why I've been using Aura. Aura shows me which data brokers are selling my information and automatically submits opt-out requests, just for me. It was simple to use and very intuitive, and I had barely gotten out of the setup process, and it was already blocking over 20 data broker requests on my behalf. Aura protects your passwords, your banking information, everything you need for day-to-day online life. Cleaning up my information not only helps reduce the amount of spam I get, but it also protects me from hackers who could use my information to help them access my social media accounts, bank accounts, other sensitive information. Things like a certain YouTube channel that you all enjoy listening to so much. Aura also does much more to protect me and my family from online threats, the kind you can't see. It comes with other features like antivirus, VPN, password management, parental controls, identity theft insurance, and more, without having to download several different apps. It really is just that easy to set up, and best of all, I get everything at one affordable price. I hear you saying, but Dr. Plague, I have one or two of these tools already. But, dear readers, not having Aura is like locking the front door and leaving the back door wide open. Readers of my fine tales can tell you why that never ends well. Aura is always on, doing the hard work of keeping me safe so I can focus on other tasks like finishing my latest book or uploading my most recent video. I value my privacy, and I know you value yours. You can go to aura.com, that's AURA.com, to start your 2-week free trial. You can also check out the link below and start your free trial with Aura. So why not give Aura a try and protect yourself from the real monsters out there? Ever since I was little, death was a next-door neighbor. I mean, literally right next door. I could look out the window and see it. I could watch through my bedroom window as Mom walked towards it. Every day, she would wake up before the sun and make her brisk walk to work. It took me a long time to discover what she did, and even longer to understand it. She would pry bodies apart and put them back together, prettier than they were when they arrived. They arrived in dark vans, bruises all over their bodies, and they would leave with eyeliner and makeup. That's where I learned that one can measure life in shades of purple, whether it be bruises or makeup. Measured, mind you, not defined. So naturally, that's where I saw my first body. I'd try to sneak in now and then, and I guess I was never successful. Mom always thwarted me, but eventually, I just wore her down. It was too much being the mortician and the security guard. So there he was, a fairly innocent death. He looked so natural, but just a little less. I always thought I would take after Mom, and for a while I was on track to. I'm not even sure how I got sidetracked. I enjoyed making Mom's job look nice. She always kept it so dour, and I had wanted to spruce up the place. I felt fulfilled when it all came together, and I felt like I normally do, just a little more. I did it for my house, then I did it for my mom, my friends, my neighbors, and before I even knew what was happening, I was trying to convince people to buy a house. My houses sold, and people took notice of how I put them together. I guess, if I were to be poetic, that's how I took after Mom. I took these houses, the remains of them, and dolled them up as best I knew how. I made it look nice. So nice that you'd never know it was dead at all. For a long time, I thought that when people died, that was it. No ghosts, no heaven or hell. It was a snap, and you were just gone. Like a house, When the furnace goes out, when the walls rot away and the spider webs consume every window, I thought the house was gone. I know now that's wrong. Despite working with my mom for many years, I never entertained the notion of ghosts. It wasn't until the house on Wilbur Street that I changed my mind. I won't go into too much detail, but that house was its own beast. And if it weren't for a strange but generous buyer, it might have been the end of my career. It was a weed, though. Something that sprouted in me, unwelcome but beautiful nonetheless. A world you might not have ever heard of. A world that probably, if not for what I'm telling you now, you would likely go your whole life without knowing about. In the housing market, there exists a small but dedicated sect reserved for the enigmatic influential, or even the nefarious. I'm talking about the buying and selling of houses that have, in one way or another, been deemed haunted. Just like any realtor, I'll get my hands on a house sometimes. Sometimes I find it myself, sometimes it's offloaded by a larger realty company. Regardless, I'll go in, make the house look as nice as possible, just like I would with any other house. That was before I discovered this unofficial and morbid market. Unlike an unafflicted house, however, I would research and experiment. With enough research, I can gather information on who perished within the house and the cause of death. I also need to be mindful of people who lived in the home but had relocated, as spirits can travel back to where their emotions were the strongest, like a magnet pulling in metal sand. After gathering the information, I conduct my small experiments. The severity and nature of the haunting need to be distinguished and defined before I can even list the house. Something you might not know about most hauntings is how consistent they are. Sure, the activity will alter, but it will happen over and over. I've had houses you could set a stopwatch by. I use a marker to outline cups and dishes in order to check if they've been pushed. I take pictures of each room every hour, on the hour, so I can meticulously comb through them. Something you may or may not know about typical hauntings is they can be boring. Rarely do you come across an outwardly aggressive home. And when you do, the type of people that buy those, it's not my place, but it's troubling to think about what they might want the home for. That's neither here nor there, though. Haunted homes sell to many people. You have eccentrics and ghost hunters who want a place for entertainment. There are people who practice the dark arts, though you can typically sniff out the wannabe types. There are even people who just really need a home and try to get a cheaper deal. Depending on the haunting and its interest, sometimes they do. You have to call it a loss at some point and lower the price just below market value. That's how you do it. That's what this house was, I thought. Another suburban home I was going to take a hit on. Boy, was I wrong. Of course, that's how tales like these come to be. If I was right, if all I ever saw was a coffee mug move across the counter, then you'd never hear a peep out of me. The house was on Carter Avenue. If you don't know which Carter Avenue out of the hundreds that likely exist, then yes, you're not meant to. I got it for a bargain from my peer because, well, it was a house that nobody had high expectations for. There wasn't a history of violence or any mention of the occult, just a younger couple that passed away in their sleep. Carbon monoxide leak. To me, though, the house was lovely, if not for a small string of reported activity. The house could have been sold on its merits. It was in a quiet neighborhood. Everything looked new and had been taken care of. It was a picture of suburban living. So I hedged my bets and thought I would just make the house look like a proper home for anyone looking to buy. It took a while, an uncomfortable amount of time, before I'd got a bite. While I toiled away, looking through photos of the house's bedroom, my phone buzzed. It was a buyer. A young couple looking to buy their first home. The woman on the phone beamed about starting a family of their own. So we set up a date to meet, and I plunged further into Carter Avenue. As bizarre as it is to say, I wanted to make sure the haunting was child-friendly. No loud noises or aggressive movements, you understand. For the most part, though, the house was quiet. Sure, there were signs, but the haunting was so mellow, you'd never know it if you weren't looking for it. A slight push that would move a cup from its outline, pictures on the wall that would go askew, and a penny was even pushed off the counter. That was all, so, just enough. It was just enough activity for it to make the difference between haunted and natural occurrence. Maybe I should have had my wits about me in that regard. Though I know, when I offer myself grace, there's no way I could have known it was anything other than a run-of-the-mill haunting. The day of the showing plays in my head from time to time. I always go back to when I was starting down the hall. It was right before the couple was supposed to show up. I stopped at the top of the stairs and looked down the hallway. It led to all the bedrooms and had light bleeding in from each. The sun was gentle and warm. It created a vignette in the hall. At the end of the hall there was a picture hanging above a small table, decorated with various books and a small fern. The picture was an oil painting, a stark mixture of black and white. Upon seeing it initially, you'd assume it was nonsense, a Rorschach test of sorts. If you took the time to soak it in, though, at least for me, I made out the picture. It almost always looked like an animal with a wide-open jaw, a howl of anguish. Once I made out the mouth, the rest followed suit. Maybe the face was meant to be beautiful, but it looked straight out of hell to me. It felt crooked. It, however, was a painting in the home that the haunting hadn't affected. To the naked eye, the painting was perfectly straight, lined right up to the surface of the table under it, but it felt crooked. I could feel the painting making one side of my head heavier, craning my neck as if trying to see it from a new angle. The hall itself felt as though it was stretching out, pulling the details of the painting further and further away from me. The once warm vignette ignited from the room, turning into static with the tunnel. So it shouldn't come as a shock when I say I nearly jumped out of my skin when I heard the front door shut. My arms rushed to my chest as if guarding me from an incoming attack. Even without my hands actually on my skin, I could feel my heart smacking around inside. A few breaths in and out calmed me, and I gathered my senses. I quickly rushed down the stairs and spotted the couple, Sandra and Owen Welling. The door had startled me, but I'd informed them upon their arrival that they could just come in, as the house wasn't exactly booked for tours. Bounding down the stairs, I immediately started in with the pleasantries. They looked as normal as can be. The woman was a blonde, her hair just barely touching her shoulders. The man looked tired, almost like he had headed straight to the home from work. His brown hair haphazardly swooped to one side. I couldn't help but notice he was sheepish, letting the woman take the lead and speaking up very little. Admittedly, this annoyed me. They were a couple, and while every dynamic is different, I found it odd that he had so little interest in where he might build a family. It happened, though, and swung both ways. Suppose it's nothing more than a pet peeve, but it did inform me to pay more attention to the wife. So, with her trailing closely behind me, we toured the lower floor. It felt almost like it used to, showing off regular homes. The activity in the house was so sparse that I'd rarely stop to talk about it. In the kitchen, I informed them that it's best to leave cups and dishes a respectful distance from the edge. In the dining room, I informed them that sometimes they could hear a knocking on the floor above. The knocking noise was not audible from anywhere else in the house, which is probably the most peculiar haunt in the home, but it's harmless. She asked questions here and there, but it wasn't until we began to ascend the stairs that she started delving deeper. In the first bedroom, she asked me who the previous occupants had been. I told her it was a young couple, though I only knew their names. We sometimes find photos left behind by the previous occupants, but this time, especially with younger folks, the families affected will snatch up photos before I even get my hands on the house. It might seem odd that I don't go too deep into the lives of those who are supposedly haunting the grounds. I did early on. I'd familiarize myself with their faces and history, but I found that doing so would cause a confirmation bias. I would see faces where there might not have been one, or I'd pick up smells related to the previous death and assume it was paranormal, when it could just be a clogged drain. The woman stalled for a moment and rested her hand on the doorframe. I could only see her back. The sun beaming through the windows wrapped a glow around her thin figure. "It's cold." I hardly heard the words when she spoke them. They were distant, like they were afraid to leave the room. She was right, though. It was cold, and noticeably so. The house was monitored for temperature variations, but nothing so severe. The skin on my arms prickled. I thought the cold would have made me shiver, but after taking in the new chill, I realized my pocket was buzzing. I ignored it, realizing the man had drifted out of sight, though only barely. He stood in the hall, looking at the same painting that had mesmerized me earlier. "This would make a great nursery," the woman said, her voice louder this time, but still distant. I was watching the man, though, his arms sheepishly jostling from side to side like he was fidgeting with something. A tension had built in my chest, partially from the cold gripping my lungs. Reaching into my pocket, I quickly retrieved the phone, intending to ignore the call as the vibrating was audible. "Oh, absolutely. It's great for sunlight in the mornings," I replied, glancing at her as I spoke. I glimpsed the same silhouette before returning to my phone's touchscreen, and just like the painting had before, the illuminated screen stole my attention. I couldn't have been more than a minute, though. Despite how long it felt, the clock in the upper right corner didn't change. An incoming call. The sensation of the phone rattling in my hand acted as a warning bell, a siren of things to come. Incoming call from Sandra Wellings. The words couldn't have felt heavier in my hands. Her voice, when I picked up the phone, couldn't have been louder in my head. I listened to the woman on the other line apologizing. She was embarrassed. They had fallen asleep on the couch and had no alarm set. She was asking me if they could still come by or if I wanted to reschedule. A reply, no matter how desperate I was for it, did not come, and as Sandra continued bidding for my attention, I could only look down the stretching hallway. In the deserted hallway, the only object present was the small white plastic dish and 2 batteries lying nearby. Suddenly, I became horrendously aware of the figure that was in the doorway. I couldn't see her as I started down the hall, but God, could I feel her. Her presence felt so stifling, I thought I might fall through the floor. A soft whimper of denial weaseled its way up my throat. It felt like I was being told a story, or rather, it felt like a story I'd already known, but that had been pushed deep down. This was someone else's story, a story of a death much more sinister than the public knew. This would be a great room for a nursery, the figure spoke, and as if those words manifested, I could feel strands of hair drop on the side of my face. She must have been as tall as she felt, hunched over with her head pressed against the ceiling, dark strands hanging like stalagmites. She wanted me to look. I could feel it. Her gaze fixed on me and burned holes through my scalp. Closer and closer. I could feel her warm breath wafting on the side of my face. The smell was more noticeable, though, or rather the lack thereof. I could only watch the painting, the hallway, once again tunneling as I pondered if it was safer to look at her or ignore her. Hauntings could get bad. Yes, even this bad. I've experienced little myself, but this wasn't my first time, though my heart still bumped like it was. When the retching began, the decision to focus on the hallway became one that I picked. A guttural and whining scrap lurched from the woman, though. It sounded like pulling marbles down from metal tubing, and after a moment, something spilled from her mouth. I could hear small thuds smacking the ground, one after another. Once again, the sound reminded me of marbles. Then she was gone. I released the breath that had been held down as her weight lifted off me, allowing my skin to loosen. Looking down, they were all splayed out at my feet. They must have rolled around quite a bit after hitting the floor. A portrait drawn with AA batteries, a tale of heartbreak, scored by the chiding of a baby. A soft whine, much softer than the woman's. That room really does get so much sun. It had rested such a lovely glow on the crib inside. I could hear the baby crying from within it. I'm sure I could have heard it from anywhere in the house. It was ethereal, something I couldn't escape. It echoed through the walls and bounced around the room as I took my first step inside. The batteries around my feet shuffled aside and rolled, clattering against one another. A game of electric billiards. The sound of the baby crying became less defined with each step I took, its cries being pulled further through the veil. The white wooden slats of the crib ceased to be an obstacle, and I could peek over the edge. I didn't intend to step further. The bile was already churning. The sides of the crib acted like a dam for the wet, sticky mess inside. All that white was painted freshly red, a crimson that glistened in the sun. My legs gave out, and I crashed to the floor. The hardwood vibrated on impact. I felt my throat choke and scratch. Burning came afterwards in intervals. I was getting air, never catching my breath. A burning rose in my chest, nails dragging. Looking down at my shirt, I could see long dark lines running along my skin, like aged scratch marks. "I'm sorry," I whispered, cowardly, pensive. Looking up, he was lying on the floor, the boyfriend, the man. He was clawing at his chest, and his body writhed. The veins in his eyes crept towards the pupils like vines. His eyes rolled up, his gaze reached far above his head. This mess of a man, he was watching her, so scared of her now. She was looming over me again. All her hate and grief sat like a ball in my neck. All her unbridled horror wrapped around me, and I felt it. I could feel the hot, stinging tears running down my cheek. All that horror, waking up in the middle of the night, feeling how weak your body is. She must have known, or maybe she saw him taking them out. He probably told her he was replacing them. A depth of despair I could only understand when I looked into her eyes. Dying, knowing the life inside of you would follow. I thought truly that her face would be horrific, a mangled mess of bones and flesh, red and pulse. Horrific indeed, but there was no blood, just tears. The streams disobeying gravity. They twisted around her face and slipped around the curves of her nose. Her very own soul, a Rorschach. Pain will paint our lives. It can shape the way we see things. It can change the feeling of a room. It can haunt the memories you once held dear. No matter how many times you try to paint over that pain, it's still there. And I felt it on my face that day, as a few of her tears relented, failing to mix with mine. I knew her more intimately than I knew myself. That's the real ghost, and I suppose it always will be. The pain. We locked eyes, and although I understood her, the fear did not subside. A part of me felt like if I moved, she would change. If I broke off the conversation, as it were, then I would see something worse. The pain was a mask, and I could feel whatever was under it was in torment. I still think about it sometimes. The man was there in all his horror, face beet red and swollen, his throat ravaged with claw marks as he gasped for air, feeling as though he was being suffocated, regretting the decision he had made, probably telling himself in his final moments that he could have just left, and he was right. Of course, he likely died thinking of himself, and that was a moment of solace for me, that in his last thoughts, he realized just how stupid he was. Even as I heard his body writhe around, pudders of liquid spilling from his mouth, even as he smacked the floor with what little strength he had left, begging for mercy, I watched his face, long and black, curtain-like strands of hair cutting off my peripherals, so all I could see was her. I stared into her face, dread growing closer. My eyes started to lose focus as she looked down at me. Her face appeared to stretch away from me like it was retreating down a hallway. She moved further and further, the guttural sound from before echoing around the column of hair she created. It got louder, growing as she shrank. Before too long, her face appeared like a two-dimensional object in the distance, just her misery, hanging solitary in a museum. At that distance, the noise was suffocating. A chirp layered on top of 1,000 other chirps until I couldn't stand it anymore, and my eyelids slammed shut. The noise halted then, and quiet returned. My breathing was deep and ragged, and after wrestling with the thought, I opened my eyes again. Staring down the hallway, I felt the phone in my pocket buzz. Reaching into it, I read that Sandra was trying to get a hold of me again. Only 3 minutes had passed since she called. Accepting the call, I heard her rambling. I only focused on what she was saying when she asked if I was showing other people around. The words came out before I thought about how to phrase them. I just asked, "Did you hear her too?" Sandra chimed that she had, but hung up when the baby started crying, as it was hurting her ears. She continued talking as I zoned out, hypnotized by the hallway once again. "The house isn't a fit for you," I cut her off, cold and direct. "This house was no place to raise a baby. Someone will buy it, but I won't sell it. A damn shame, too. The light coming in through the window at the end of the hall really livens up the place." You're still here. Thanks so much for joining us for tonight's spooky tale. If you'd like a little bit more spooky in your life, why not click on one of the videos that appears at the end of our story, or maybe head on over to one of our playlists where you can get your fill of spooky content. If you like your spooky a little more tactile, I've got a new book that's come out. If you'd like your own copy, there's a link below in the description where you can get your own copy of my spooky book. If you like what you see here on the channel and think you might like to support in a more monetized way, then why not come over to Patreon or become a member on YouTube? Speaking of, let's go ahead and thank our members now. Thanks to Civ Garstad, Unicorn Hollow, and Army Dude for being our spooky ghost contributors. Thanks to Janet, Lee Kendall, Saikat, Ronda J, Sue Casper, and Valinator for being our spooky skeleton contributors. And thanks to Oh Snap, Hi Stacy, Winter, Xaronan, Stephanie Carrington, Tyler Parker, Cinnamon Fox, Grim Reaper, TomBoiTopUwU, and Queen Sheebah for being our ghostly reader tier contributors. And a big thanks to Scott Donahue for being our ghostly writer tier contributor. Thanks, everyone. We just couldn't do the show without you. If you'd like to support the channel, then come on down to Patreon or become a member on YouTube. Spooky Skeleton tier contributors, that's our $5 tier, get their spooky 12 hours early at 8:30 a.m. as opposed to 8:30 p.m. My time, of course. And while ghostly reading is a only a tier that's available on Patreon, you get a signed copy of my book anytime I write one on your doorstep in hopefully a timely manner. If you'd like a book, we have many on Amazon. I've got links below if you'd like to follow those. Should get you to my page so you can buy any one of my 8 books I believe we're up to now. I'm sure they'd look really nice on your shelf, and I'll sign them for you if you can find me out in the wild. And as always, thanks for stopping by. Dr. Plague, signing off. Have a wonderful evening.